And on behalf of the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on the current biologics and biosimilars landscape in Canada. Today we'll be joined by John Snowden, Director of Biosimilars at Amgen Canada. He is also a founding member and current co-chair for the newly formed Industry Trade Association, the Canadian Biosimilar Forum. Some information about this webinar. Biologic cancer treatments have become incredibly important in oncology, but they can be expensive. Biosimilars are molecules manufactured to replicate the effects of biologics. They give patients and providers a choice and help to drive prices down through competition. But doctors, patients, and caregivers need to understand what biosimilars are, what they can do, and the strengths and limits of this new frontier in medicine. The presentation will be followed by interactive discussion with participants. Please use the question box on the right hand of your screen to ask any questions. There's a box you can type in there. We'd like to thank Amgen, Boehringer Ingelheim, Merck, and Novartis for their support of today and other webinars. If you haven't attended an earlier webinar, this webinar is hosted by the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network. At CCSN, we work with patients, survivors, families, partner groups, and sponsors on collaborative action to identify and remove barriers to optimal patient care, to ensure education, access, and action opportunities and survivor involvement in healthcare decision-making, and to support evidence-based research on ways to promote equal access to early diagnosis, timely treatment, and follow-up care. If you want to learn more about CCSN, you can visit us on our website, www.survivornet.ca. This webinar will be available online tomorrow. There will be full video on YouTube, as well as slides, which will be on our SlideShare account. Links to both will be sent out tomorrow afternoon to everyone who's registered. Now, over to you, John.
Okay, just do a quick sound check. I'm hoping you can hear me. Hello?
You're all good, John. Go ahead.
Can you? Oh, we're all good. Okay, sorry, just making sure that we were good. Okay, well, thanks to everybody for joining today's call. I'd like to thank the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network for allowing us to participate in this and present in this, I think, very timely topic in the Canadian marketplace. I can just tell by the diversity of people that were just introduced that this is definitely a topic of interest to many different stakeholders, of which the most important, I think, at the end of the day is the patient. So just to give you some perspective on where I will be coming from this presentation, as the slide here says, I work for a company called Amgen Canada. We are a large multinational biotech company that has been manufacturing, researching, and developing innovative biosimilars for almost 40 years, and we've introduced many of those products into the Canadian marketplace. About 6-7 years ago, the company decided that they would also invest in developing biosimilars to complement our skills and capabilities that we've learned in the innovative biologic market. So that's the perspective that I'll be coming at with today as an employee of Amgen, but we'll try to be provide an impartial view on thoughts on biosimilars. So for today's presentation, I've broken the presentation down into 4 basic parts. The first part is I want to talk a little bit about what is a biologic. I think that that's some foundational information that we need to understand to be able to put in context why biosimilars are a little bit different and unique than a generic like model that we would be used to in the small molecule world. Once I've done that, I'll talk a little bit about what is a biosimilar and why there's growing interest in these types of new biologics. Talk a little bit about Health Canada's perspective, and within that context, I want to talk about an important issue around distinguishable naming. That will become evident as I go through the presentation. And lastly, I'll conclude with some thoughts and opinions around patient safety and the importance of physician and patient choice. So let's start off with what is a biologic medicine. And in essence, unlike a generic, or unlike a small molecule, which is synthetically synthesized through through chemical interactions. Biologics are large and very complex molecules that are made in living organisms, specifically either bacterial, yeast, and or mammalian cells would be the most common platforms. And what these platforms do is they genetically engineer DNA using complex manufacturing processes. So as the pictures illustrate below, you kind of go from a basic single cell to cell expansion into a large manufacturing capabilities, which you see in the middle, and ultimately you're producing a biologic compound, which is represented on the right, and I'll get into more detail on exactly that manufacturing process and some of those changes. But the key takeaway message from this is that these are made in living cells and tend to be much more complex than what we would see with a small molecule. Now, biologics are used to treat many serious conditions. I know of great interest today on the phone will be many patients involved in cancer or healthcare providers, and biologics certainly have played a significant role in transforming that landscape. They're also used quite extensively in some of the autoimmune system disorders such as rheumatoid arthritis, such as irritable bowel disease or severe plaque psoriasis. We also see them being used in neurological disorders such as MS, as well as hematological conditions such as anemia, low white blood cell counts, and or low platelet counts. And what the biologic does is that they are really there to replace or augment beneficial human proteins and monoclonal antibodies which combat specific diseases, and they do it with fairly enhanced precision. So they're quite a significant advancement in how we're treating diseases and tend to be very targeted in their approach. So as I alluded to a little bit earlier, biologics are very large molecules, and what you can see from the illustration here on the left-hand side, we see a common small molecule that I've referred to as acetylsalic acid or aspirin, what we would commonly know it as. A relatively small molecule, it's about 180 Daltons in weight and about 21 atoms altogether. And if you compare that with some of the more recent biologics that are now being manufactured on the right-hand side, monoclonal antibodies, which are quite extensive in their use in the biologic spectrum, you can see that both not only in size but also in structure that these are significantly more complex molecules. They're about 1,000 times heavier and about 1,000 times more complex in terms of the atomic structure, as well as being made in a living system. So we often use an analogy of it's comparing of a bicycle to the complexity of a jetliner to kind of give you a spectrum of difference in complexity. And when it comes to biosimilars, obviously that complexity becomes a challenge in terms of producing something that delivers a similar type of outcome. So really important to understand that these are much more complex and much more elaborate than the small molecules that we would be used to from a pill perspective. In addition to the complexity of the molecule, I think manufacturing biologics themselves is also a very complex process. And it all starts kind of on the left-hand side, where a company will establish a cell line by transvecting or introducing DNA into thousands of types of cells until ultimately they find a cell line that is able to express the desired quantity and quality of protein or biologic that they're trying to grow within the cell. And once an appropriate cell line has been found, what then happens is we create a master cell bank, which is basically a scaling up of that cell line. And that master cell bank is particularly important as it will be used in perpetuity for the lifetime of the biologic medicine, such that each time a lot of a drug is made, the vial from the master cell bank will be in a stepwise fashion increased in volume until they move into what you can see in the second picture, which is a bioreactor system. And these cells are encouraged to grow and replicate, as well as to produce that protein or that biologic medicine in a very controlled type of environment. Now, once you've had enough protein, or that the cells that have replicated probably into about trillions of different cells, and they're manufacturing that protein, once you've expressed enough of that protein, you then need to isolate it and purify it in a manner that doesn't disrupt the complex structure of that molecule that I just described. So there's quite a number of steps that are involved in doing that, and a number of quality assurance steps involved to ensure that what you've isolated and ultimately purified is the product that you're desiring. You then move on to the characterization and stability testing stage, of which what you're really trying to do there is to make sure that the quality attributes that you intended to develop with that biologic are intact, and that the molecule and the compound itself is stable. From that, you then move on to formulation, which is basically the constituent that the product is put into, generally, usually some type of liquid form. And then it's moved into a fill and finish, which is typically done in a vial or a pre-filled syringe, and ultimately packaged and then shipped off to the hospital or the pharmacy to be injected into a patient. So through this process, there are hundreds of quality checks to ensure that you have a tightly regulated process, and that you consistently are manufacturing and delivering a high quality product. An important element of this, and particularly when we start talking about the biosimilars, is all of this information and process and cell line are proprietary in nature. So when it comes to manufacturing or developing a biosimilar, you don't necessarily have a lens into all of these different steps, as I said, as they're proprietary in nature. So it's an important element to remember when we talk about biosimilars. So I'm going to move on now to talk about what a biosimilar is. And Health Canada has defined a biosimilar as a biologic drug that obtains market authorization subsequent to a version previously authorized in Canada, and that has demonstrated similarity to the reference product. And what you can also see is the FDA and the EMEA have also talked about this demonstration of similarity and being highly similar to that product with no clinical meaningful difference between the two products, that they're safe and they're pure and they have a comparable degree of potency. So it's good to see that our regulatory bodies around the world are converging to a common definition around that aspect of similarity. However, as I talked about, biosimilars by definition are similar to the original biologic, but they can't, at least based on today's science, they're not able to be identical. And a large part of that is because, as I've just described, that these products are genetically engineered in living cells using these complex manufacturing processes that are proprietary, and that they're virtually impossible to replicate with the existing science that we have today. So biologics clearly are medicines that can be highly similar to, but not identical to the original product as they're intended to replicate. So we sometimes at Amgen use this analogy of a snowflake, where snowflakes have similar types of outcomes. They're cold, they're slippery, they're fall from the sky, they have a lot of common characteristics, but when you look at them under a microscope, there may be some structural differences across the snowflakes, and that is potentially the case, or is the case, with biosimilars. However, what's important is, and I'll talk about in a minute from a regulatory perspective, is that those differences should not have any clinical meaningful differences to the reference product. So it's kind of an analogy way of showing the differences and or similarities between a reference product and a biologic, or pardon me, a biosimilar. Now, as I alluded to a little bit earlier, developing and manufacturing biosimilars definitely take on another level. What the biosimilar manufacturer knows is they know the gene code, they know the amino acid sequence of the reference product, but there are a lot of unknown characteristics or a lot of unknown factors in developing that biosimilar. They don't have access to that cell line, so they have to establish their own cell line. They don't have access to the manufacturing process, such as the growth medium, the formulation methods, the reagents, etc. So those all have to be iteratively developed, and using analytical characterization, testing kind of back and forth to make sure that you've got a product that has similar structure and characteristics, and where there are differences, to test that they are not clinically relevant in terms of safety or efficacy. So through that iteration, ultimately what you're trying to do is make sure that you've demonstrated a high level of structural and functional similarity between the reference product and the biosimilar that you're manufacturing and developing. So obviously an interesting science topic, but also there's an element of why this interest in biosimilars is growing. As was alluded to in the introduction, biologics are expensive products. And I think, as you can see from the amount of research, the development, the manufacturing process, it's understandably why these products are much more expensive than a small molecule that we would typically take in a pill format. So if you look at biologics, they represent about 2% of prescriptions, but they're making up about 25% of pharmaceutical sales. And they're growing at about over 3 times the rate of what a small molecule market would be growing at. So not only are they expensive, but because of the efficacy and the life-changing benefits that these products can bring, they're growing at a faster pace. And if you look at the top pharmaceutical products in Canada, the top 4 of those products, in fact, are biologics, and they're represented on the left side here with asterisks, and you can see the sales value of those products. Also, I know of interest today is the oncology portfolio, and here again you can see the 4 of the top 5 oncological products that are being sold in Canada are also biosimilars, or pardon me, biologic agents. So there's great interest not only by the payers but also by clinicians who are also stewards of our budgets on can these products bring increased competition and potential increased savings to the system that hopefully can be reinvested back into new innovation, such as some of the new oncological products that are coming down the pipeline on an ongoing basis. Quintiles IMS, which is basically a think tank in the pharmaceutical industry, recently presented some predictions on the possibility of when some of these large products are losing their patents, the value of them, and the potential of harnessing some of the increased competition and potential savings. So you can see many of the products that I've just talked about on this list of products that are coming up to patent expiry, or where their patents have expired, and in some cases, as I will talk about in a minute, have actual biosimilars have entered into these spaces. If we take a look at the global landscape of biosimilars, Canada is actually a fair bit behind the rest of the world. Biosimilars were introduced in Europe back in 2006. And as of September of last year, there were 23 approved biosimilars in that marketplace. I suspect when I update this slide at the end of this year that will probably increase to closer to probably 27 to 30 new compounds that have been approved, and you can see the spectrum of molecules on the left-hand side that have seen biosimilars enter into the market on. Australia is also fairly well advanced with their initial approval in 2008. Similarly in Japan, but as I alluded to in North America, and in this example the US, and I will talk about Canada in a minute, it's still a fairly nascent market that's developing in terms of the introduction of biosimilars into the landscape. So if we take a look specifically at Health Canada, they have now approved 7 biosimilars with 12 files pending in oncology. So the first biosimilar was actually approved back in 2009. It was a Sandoz product, but we saw a bit of a hiatus between 2009 and 2014, where we saw 2 products approved, Inflectra and Remsima, which are biosimilars to infliximab, of which only one of them ultimately launched, Inflectra. But we also have seen subsequent to that 4 other approvals, of filgrastim and insulin, and 2 etanercept molecules. So we're starting to see an acceleration of approvals, and we're likely going to see a number of new compounds coming forward, and many of those files that are pending or under review by Health Canada are in the oncology setting. Now, in anticipation of the biosimilar landscape and the products coming on board back in March of 2010, Health Canada had the foresight to develop an initial biosimilar guidance document with its intention on providing guidance to manufacturers and healthcare professionals on how to bring biologics into the Canadian marketplace. And they subsequently updated that in November of 2016. And I'm going to just talk a little bit about those documents and some of the key tenets behind that. So as I'd mentioned, this guidance document was provided or was made available to provide assistance to the industry and to healthcare providers. In addition to the update in November of 2016, they also published a fact sheet, which is on the right-hand side, on biosimilars. And this fact sheet is a very useful tool for those of you that want to explore a little bit more detail about what biosimilars are. It basically gives you all the fundamental information that you need to know on what a biosimilar is, how it's approved, how it's regulated on an ongoing basis, and several other considerations around pharmacovigilance and switching and other topics of the like. So certainly I won't have a chance to go through all of those today, but if you're looking for further reference, I highly recommend taking a look at the Health Canada fact sheet. So it's certainly our belief, and I think we're very fortunate in Canada, that Health Canada has developed a very robust science-based regulatory framework for biosimilars. And what this slide hopefully illustrates on the left-hand side is what a generic small molecule will go through, and then what's required for a biosimilar. Not surprisingly, given the complexity of a biologic and the biosimilar landscape, there are some obviously differences that need to be considered, and subsequently the regulatory evidence and evidence generation between those two needs to be different. So on the left-hand side, you'll see generics have to establish that they've got an active ingredient, and again, being chemically synthesized, you can pretty much demonstrate that it's a identical product, and then you need to demonstrate bioequivalence through phase 1 PK PD studies. On the other hand, with biosimilars, being similar and not the same, you have to provide a fairly extensive structural and functional characterization of the biosimilar molecule to demonstrate that similarity, and where there are differences to demonstrate that they're likely not clinically meaningful. There's consideration for animal data to assess toxicity, although that's probably something that's going to become less important over time. But what's, I think, probably extremely important is that the clinical development programs of biosimilars are much more expansive than what you would see with a generic product. You have to do clinical studies to compare the PK/PD studies, but you also, in many cases, will be required to do a phase 3 study looking at the safety, efficacy, and immunogenicity comparisons directly to the reference product. So these would be head-to-head trials comparing the biosimilar to the reference product. So ultimately, what you're trying to generate, and what Health Canada is expecting, is that you have sufficient data to demonstrate that the product is highly similar to the reference product, that it's safe and pure and potent for one or more of the approved indications of use. So again, I think that guidance document that they provided, again, we're fortunate in Canada to have that robust science-based regulatory framework. Now, there are some other key tenets or key principles on biosimilars that Health Canada has communicated through these 2 documents that I've referred to. And the first is that Health Canada does view a biosimilar as a new drug. So it goes through the new drug approval process, not the generic pathway, and goes through those rigorous standards that I just talked about. And ultimately, Health Canada views a biosimilar as a standalone biologic agent requiring the same post-marketing pharmacovigilance requirements that you would see with a biologic medicine. Now, the other thing that they've clearly pointed out in their document is that these are not generic drugs and that the authorization is not a declaration of pharmaceutical equivalence, bioequivalence, or clinical equivalence to the reference product. And subsequently, in the fact sheet, they recommend that a decision to switch a patient being treated with a reference biologic to a biosimilar should be made by a treating physician in consultation with the patient, taking into account available clinical evidence and any policies related to the relevant jurisdiction. So given that these are complex molecules treating grievous diseases, and that although they're very similar, it needs to be really under the physician's remit to decide what product is the best for that patient, and needs to be done in consultation with the patient. So the other topic that I think is particularly important in the regulatory world is to talk a little bit about distinguishable non-proprietary names, and it's certainly our belief that this can assist with traceability measures. So historically, non-proprietary names have been specific to defined active substance regardless of the manufacturer. So I'll give the example of a small molecule. Many of you on the line would be familiar with the drug Lipitor. It's a LDL-lowering, lipid-lowering agent. It's commonly used to treat hyperlipidemia. It has the trade name of Lipitor and a non-proprietary name or generic name of atorvastatin. And many physicians will write the product as atorvastatin, and you'll take your prescription to the market, and it could get filled with any number of manufacturer atorvastatins. And given that those products are identical and that they're viewed as interchangeable and at the provincial levels, that would be certainly an acceptable practice. However, in the case of a biosimilar, where these products are not viewed as interchangeable, today in Canada, we still use only that single distinguishable name. So if I use the product Enbrel, the generic name would be etanercept, or the non-proprietary name would be etanercept. If a physician were to write etanercept, that could get filled with any one of three biologic medicines currently in Canada. There's the originator, and there are two biosimilars to that etanercept molecule. That may not be an issue if it's the first prescription for the patient, but what happens if it's the second and third or fourth repeat prescription and there isn't any distinguishable naming and the physician hasn't used the trade name? What drug will that patient be on? And will that patient potentially be switched back and forth across different products, which could be problematic for the patient? And it's certainly our belief that by providing a distinguishable non-proprietary name that allows you to delineate between the reference product and across the different biosimilars, that this certainly can help prevent any inadvertent or inappropriate substitution or unintended switching at the dispensing level. If there are any adverse events related to any specific product, that they be attributed back to the right molecule to be determined if it's a molecule effect or if it's an individual product effect. And it would also avoid implying that the reference product and the biosimilar molecules are identical. So a number of agencies have taken a look at how do we address this issue. The FDA is probably the most advanced, and they've actually implemented a system which I'll talk about, as well as the WHO have also been looking at a distinguishable naming approach. But I'll draw your attention to the middle box here, where the FDA now has draft guidance on this approach. And what they are now implementing in the U.S. market is that all biosimilars will receive a unique four-letter suffix attached with a hyphen. So the etanercept example that I gave you before, it could be etanercept number 1 could be etanercept hyphen ATTO, etanercept ABCD, and etanercept XYJ, to try to differentiate when we're using that generic or distinguishable name. Now, to date, Health Canada has not issued guidance on this biosimilar nomenclature, and I know the number of the trade associations in the pharmaceutical biologics arena, and a number of the companies themselves are advocating that Health Canada do adopt an FDA-like approach, but at this point they have not adopted that. They've stated that they do support the principle of it, but have not integrated that into the Canadian marketplace at this point. So we continue to work with them and encourage them to adopt a similar policy, and I think it's an important step for ensuring the ongoing integrity of biosimilars and ensuring that patients are ultimately getting the right product that was intended to be prescribed to them. So the last topic I want to talk about is a little bit about the patient safety and choice. And I've alluded to this in my presentation, that there certainly are theoretical potential problems in switching patients back and forth between biologic and biosimilar drugs and across biosimilars. And that is thought to certainly increase the risk of immune responses against the drug itself. So certainly not something that we're wanting to see happen in the biosimilar space as we begin to adopt them into the Canadian marketplace. Thus the need for the distinguishable naming that I've talked about, amongst other checks and balances to ensure that the intended product is what's dispensed. We also believe that physicians should be well informed on each of the product's risk-benefit profile, and the kind of Bible for that risk assessment is the product monograph that Health Canada reviews with the manufacturer and updates with the manufacturer, updates with the manufacturer on an ongoing basis to ensure that that physician can be well informed about his or her decisions as it relates to the product or the biosimilar that they're going to prescribe. And lastly, a tenet that I believe is very important is that physicians, in consultation with their patients, should be the ones that retain the decision-making role in the choice of which biologic is most appropriate for their patient and that the condition that's being treated. I think when you get to that end of one of patient, it really needs to be down to the physician and the patient to make the ultimate choice around what product is best for that patient. So in summary, Biologics, I believe, certainly have a significant role to play in the healthcare system, and I hope I've communicated that effectively in the presentation. These biologics, including biosimilars, are large, complicated molecules that are made in living cells using complex manufacturing processes that are distinct and unique to each manufacturer, which is the reason why biosimilars can be highly similar but not necessarily identical to that innovator product. Now, as I mentioned, I believe we're very lucky, or very fortunate is probably the better word, that Health Canada has a robust regulatory framework to ensure that the biosimilars in Canada that are approved are of high quality, that they're safe and they're efficacious, but approval does not mean interchangeability and that these products can be moved back and forth. Thus, it's our belief that all biologics should have a distinguishable name to ensure ongoing safety and ongoing ensuring that the patient is getting the drug that's intended. Now, biosimilars have the promise to increase competition and generate, I think, sizable savings into Canada that we hope will be reinvested into new innovation, and certainly oncology and oncology treatments is a critical area and an important priority for Canadians. Now, while those economic savings are important, though, I want to stress that patient safety, ensuring that we've got high quality manufacturing and that those manufacturers can provide reliable supply are paramount important elements to be considering. If you're going to generate savings but you can't supply the product to the market, particularly in an area like oncology, that's not an acceptable solution going forward. So decisions around biosimilars, yes, savings are important, but we need to also factor in some other important elements. And my last point is that I believe physician and patient choice is critical in the decision-making process of which medicine the patient should receive based on the condition that they're treating and based on the physician's and patient's choice around what's best for them. So that is concludes the presentation, a little bit ahead of schedule on that time, but I'm certainly open to take questions.
All right, thanks a lot, John. I'll just jump in here and start the question and answer portion of the presentation now. So if you do have questions, we encourage you to go over to the right-hand side of your screen in the GoToWebinar control panel, and over there you'll find the questions box where you can type in any questions that you may have. And just while we're waiting for everyone to send in their questions, just a quick couple of housekeeping notes. We are recording this webinar, so the webinar will be up on YouTube tomorrow, and everybody who registered will get a link to that. The slides, we're actually unfortunately not authorized to distribute those slides from this webinar, so those will not be available, but you will be able to watch this webinar on YouTube if you want to go back and take a look at anything in this presentation. So just a quick housekeeping note there so everybody is aware. And so again, we'll just let people know if you do have any questions, just go ahead and type them in that questions box on the right-hand side there. And while we're waiting for that, we can also just go over some quick outro notes. CCSM, we just want to thank you, John, for coming on today and sharing your expertise in this very important field of research. We'll also let everyone know that you can stay tuned to our website and also sign up for our e-letter there for other opportunities to join future webinars. And so we've got one from Dennis here. I know she's just saying thank you for a great and clear presentation, so that's a nice compliment. Catherine is asking, when do you think AC will approve distinguishable naming?
So I'm assuming AC is Health Canada. So Health Canada has publicly stated that they do support a distinguishable naming approach, as I suggested in my presentation. In conversation with them through some of the recent bilateral meetings that we've had through the Trade Association, they have stated that they do plan to make this a priority for the balance of 2017 and into 2018. I haven't heard them make a firm commitment on a date, but I would certainly hope it would be in the 2018 timeframe. And why that's particularly important is we're now entering an era where there aren't just one biosimilar of the reference product, but we're now starting to see multiple entrants of the biosimilars, as is the etanercept example that I gave. We have the reference Enbrel, we have two biosimilar products, Barenzi's and Erelzi, that are now in the marketplace, and I think we'll likely see infliximab, the Remicade compound, see more than one biosimilar in the marketplace as well. So it's becoming much more of an important issue, and we certainly are urging Health Canada to make a decision on this sooner than later.
Great. Thanks, John. We have more of a comment here from Sean, I think, and he's saying, I think it would be useful. I think it would be useful for the group to have full Health Canada position on switch. The first part is that Health Canada considers a well-controlled switch from reference biologic drugs to a biosimilar to be acceptable.
Yeah, so that's a fair comment, and ironically, I was just having discussions about that this morning. There's a lot of positions that Health Canada has in those two documents that I've talked about, so I took a selection of those today. But they have certainly presented that. It's not currently in their fact sheet document, but I know Kathy Parker, the director of BGDV, certainly has been communicating that in recent presentations. So I would agree with that statement, yeah.
And then he just followed up with second part. He said you had already mentioned it, that it remains a decision between patient and physician with respect to provincial jurisdiction.
I'm not sure I'm understanding. Is that a question or a comment?
I think it's just a second part of the comment.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, ultimately, the province does make the decision on interchangeability, and to date, none of the provinces have made a decision to make biologics or biosimilars interchangeable with the reference product at this point in time.
All right, now we have one in here from Ganiv saying, do you know if there have been any policy changes regarding non-medical switching from originator biologics for stably responding patients with arthritis, Crohn's disease, or other chronic diseases to biosimilars in European or Australian jurisdictions?
Yeah, there certainly have been a range of decisions that different countries have made regarding biosimilars and the implementation of biosimilars. We see many countries adopting similar to what Canada has done, which is the adoption of newly started or new to molecule patients being required to start with the biosimilar. But we also see other countries, Norway would probably be the one that comes to my mind, that have moved to a tendering process whereby each year they will tender the molecule to a given company to acquire that business. So there's a whole spectrum of different types of adoption policies that the countries have taken. Certainly Australia is another example that you referred to in there. And what I understand from the Australia situation is that a pharmacist can switch the biosimilar for the reference product unless the physician has written on the prescription no substitution and or the brand name, to which then the pharmacist can't do that switching. So it's still left up to the physician to make that, ultimately to make that choice.
Okay, great. And now we have one coming in from Alan, and he's asking, so if a patient is already on a biologic, he or she generally should not be switched to a biosimilar without consultation between physician and patient, correct? However, for a new script, a payer could default to a biosimilar as the basis for coverage.
Yeah, and I think that that's quite a rational approach for the payer to do. It's a reasonable place to start to gain comfort with biosimilars, to understand how they're working. That bio-naive patient is certainly a reasonable patient to start. You're not switching them off of their existing medication. So yeah, I would generally agree with that comment and give the context. That's certainly what payers in the Canadian marketplace, or at least the public payers, have generally chosen to do thus far.
Okay, great. And I think with that, that's all the questions that we have right now. And if anybody has more questions that they think about later, I would direct you to, actually, if you could go to the next slide there, John. I think there's a couple of emails and contact options for people there, and you can send some emails in there if you want to get in touch and ask any more questions. And with that, I think I will pass it back over to Mona at CCSN to do a final sign-off. And yeah, thanks everybody. Mona, I think you just got to unmute your mic there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, John, for a really interesting presentation. Thank you for joining us today and sharing your expertise in this very important field of research and upcoming new things. Stay tuned to our website and sign up for our e-letter for other opportunities to join our webinars. Generally, they're every second Thursday, and there are additional webinars in between, depending on circumstances. A reminder, this webinar will be available online tomorrow, and there'll be a full video on YouTube. Links to both will be sent out tomorrow by the early afternoon. Thank you for attending. Thank you again, John. Thank you, Matt, for supporting us, and I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon.